Hi, welcome to Hindsight History. I'm Nick Owens. Nearly 60 years have passed since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. Gerald Posner is one of America's preeminent investigative journalists and writers. His book, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of John F. Kennedy, is recognized as the gold standard of the event and has been praised for stripping away the myth and focusing on the hard evidence of that tragic day. This is stuff I really love to talk about. So Gerald Posner, thank you for indulging me and being here.
Thanks, Nick, for having me. Actually, I'm a fan of Hindsight History. So when you reached out and said, can we have a chance to talk about Case Closed? I was enthusiastic. I'm very glad to be here with you.
Fantastic. Well, we should start with really my belief that when this book came out, I thought there's no way I could read anything on the Kennedy assassination that I didn't know. I'm a big John F. Kennedy fan. I've got friends I can talk with for hours on end and really get into the minutia of the assassination. And I thought I knew everything. Your book comes along and I realized I knew nothing, and I was blown away by it. As a millennial, it's always tempting to consider anything that a Joe Rogan or an Oliver Stone says as gospel. And even when I go to the bookstore, I notice that there's certain sections, for instance, the Beatles, there will be dozens of books. JFK Assassination, there will be 800 books. And a mentor of mine, a gentleman named Roger McGrath, did me such a favor by recommending that I read your book, Case Closed. What you've written is so logical that you read it and it shows you, oh, there can only be one answer. So I'd love to start and knowing what brought you to write this book when so many books on the subject had been written?
Well, I didn't start out to write this book. And what I mean by that is I didn't start out to write a book that had an answer about who killed Kennedy. I didn't think that was possible. That would take a level of overconfidence and hubris that I don't think anybody would have. But I mean, I'd always been interested in the assassination. I was in 4th grade when Kennedy was killed in a Catholic school being taught by nuns. He was the first Catholic president. It was a traumatic day in all of the community and for the country, but especially for Catholics who had the president there. And I remember those early days. And then when I was in law school, the House Select Committee was doing its work in the late 70s. I followed the case. It wasn't something that was at the top of my agenda to be the biggest issue I thought was around, but I was always been intrigued by it. When I started to write books for a living, I went to Random House in 1989 and said, what about a book on the Kennedy assassination? As a lawyer, in another life, it seemed I was a lawyer. I'd like to go through the case. I know it can't all be right. And what I mean by that is it can't be that the KGB killed him and that Castro killed him and that the mafia killed him, right? And there's a front shooter, or there's a shooter from the sewer. It can't all be correct. Let me go through with a lawyer's eye on the evidence, determine what's bogus, and then narrow it down to 4 or 5 issues we can solve and say, this is a book you have to read before you read any other book on the assassination because it's a primer of what's real, right? The Random House said in 1989, no one will be interested in that. And so instead I did a book called Hitler's Children, Sons and Daughters of Nazi War Criminals, very, very different. And then Oliver Stone, you mentioned before, did the one favor he ever did for me. He did a fantastic film that was terrible history, right? But it brought Kennedy back up onto the radar for the American public. Everybody was thinking JFK assassination. And Random House said, you know what? That book you were thinking of doing, maybe there's a book to do in that. I signed that book up, and it was only halfway through the research on this book when I started to realize, together with Tricia, as my wife and works with me, we kept thinking, gee, we're answering a lot of these things and we think it's Oswald. And that's when I went and told the publisher that, had a meeting with them, with my editor and the head of the house, and said, I don't think you need to put out a book that says, here's a primer on the case. You could put out a book that says, here's who killed Kennedy. And they said, who? I said, Oswald. And who? And I said, Oswald. And you can imagine, I wish I had a recording or tape of that meeting, because there was a look of shock, because their concern was what you said in your question. Hundreds and hundreds of books out there that say it's a conspiracy. The head of Random House believed it was a conspiracy. How could I possibly conclude it was Oswald?
Right.
And when we did publish that book in 1993 on the 30th anniversary, there was a concern in the publisher that no one would care, that people, the 5 or 10% who thought it was Oswald would say, I don't need to buy that book because I know it. And the Joe Rogans and Oliver Stones of the world would say, oh, Warren Commission said that 30 years ago, and we've already gone way past that. I didn't realize that 3 decades after, much less almost 6 decades after now, that the most controversial position turned out not to be 5 shooters at Dealey Plaza, but turned out to be that one 24-year-old kid with a cheap rifle, a bad scope, managed to kill the president. And people would look at me like, you got to be kidding. You believe that? You really think that's true? And then when they saw it was new and the new evidence and what could be done with ballistics, then they got excited about it. But you have to follow the evidence. It would be great if I could have come back with a story that said I found the evidence of the mafia or whatever else in a conspiracy. That's a fake story. But in the end, this is the story I found, and I believe it's the accurate story in the history of what happened that day in Dallas. So that's how Case Closed ended up becoming a book. There was even a moment, by the way, in the run-up to publication in which you discuss titles with your publisher. They eventually are responsible for them. Case Closed became one of the titles we were thinking about. Should it have a question mark after? Case Closed. And it was actually my editor who said no. He said, because it answers that question. We knew it was a brazen title and would get people upset, and it did. And the case will never be closed for most people, but horse provocative title.
Excellent. And if I were to have asked you before beginning this process what you thought of the JFK assassination, you would have said?
I would have said that I lean to thinking that the mob was somehow involved, only for this. When people say to you, and I believe this is the case for a historian and a reporter and investigative journalist, if they say they entered into a topic, they're looking into whether an election was real or faked or whether somebody was corrupt, nobody goes in with a blank slate. We always know a little something from what we've read. We have a leaning one way or the other. And my leaning was toward the mob only because of Jack Ruby's murder of Oswald. It had, to me, all of the earmarks of what would look like a mob silencing.
Right.
So that's where I was. But the hard part, not the hard part, is what I think is required in terms of history, is you have to go where the evidence takes you. So if you go into a subject with a predetermined idea of what you want to have the book conclude, then you just look for the evidence and the stories that confirm what you already think. If you really just want to create the history, you look for the information that tells the story and the information that's most credible. And so what I mean by that is there's a wane of evidence that comes time and time again in the Kennedy assassination. And I rely on what I consider the best evidence. So, for instance, if I'm talking about the location of wounds on the president, I will rely not on what an eyewitness sees on the president's body when they're treating him at Parkland Hospital, but on the x-rays and the photos from the autopsy. Some people will say, I think those are fake. Okay, let's discuss that. Is there any evidence of fakery? We can look for them and see if they're authentic or not. So you have to find the evidence you believe is credible, real, and then rely on it. Doesn't mean you don't have inconsistent information, but that's the real task for a writer, a researcher, a historian, to cut through all of that and say, this is the story and this is what I rely on to make those conclusions.
Right. You've been quoted as saying a lot of researchers, they get stuck in Dealey Plaza. They get stuck in the ballistics and at the assassination site. I've got a theory that with any small event, it's very easy to tease apart anything. Us as humans, our brains are very good at finding patterns. Problem is we find patterns that aren't there, which is where you get a lot of the, well, wait a minute. There were 9 guys at Dealey Plaza with blow darts. There's an umbrella man, a radio man, 3 tramps, 35 different rifles. It's almost biology. We've worn these neural grooves in our brains. But really, when you think, and in the conclusion of Oliver Stone's film, JFK, what he's really positing at the end would involve about 750 people. all of whom would be instantly famous and rich if they went on Oprah in the 80s and said, okay, here's what happened. And I think it's really Occam's razor. Usually the best answer, is the first most logical one is the right one. But for us, it just sounds too simple and too ordinary that we don't go there.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. William Manchester, the historian who wrote Death of a President, sort of summarizes it very well in his book. He says it's hard for us, he compared it to World War II, in which he said, on one side you have 6 million dead Jewish victims and millions of dead, gypsies and communists and everybody else who were killed by the Nazis. And the other side, the Nazis are the criminals, greatest crime. Balances. The Kennedy assassination, on the one hand, you have this young, charismatic president, so much potential for the future. Camelot. And on the other side of the scale, you have this just turned 24-year-old kid who's like a loser in life with a bad rifle, and he ends it. It doesn't seem right. And if you put a conspiracy on the Oswald side, if Kennedy was killed because he was going to disband the CIA, or he was killed because he was going to take us out of Vietnam, or anything else, it gives some meaning to his death. And there's a desire to do that. And I think that when you say people get stuck in Dealey Plaza, or I've said that they spend too much time there, because I believe that the evidence is in Dealey Plaza overwhelming that whoever shot the president that day, take out that it was Oswald, whoever shot the president that day, only one shooter hit the president. That shooter was firing from behind the president in the motorcade in the general area where Oswald was left half an hour before the assassination by his coworkers. That person hit the president. No other. If there was another shooter at Dealey Plaza, they missed the president. They were never caught. Nobody else hit him. So Dealey Plaza involves 3 shots, and we can go through them in more detail. Doesn't establish a conspiracy there. The reason to stay in Dealey Plaza, if you're examining this as a researcher, is if you can establish evidence of conspiracy there. If you can show there was another shooter or 4 shots were required, that's it. You have a conspiracy from the get-go, because the shooter from behind only has time for those 3 shots to get off. So 4th shot, or the people in the car, like the Governor Conley and President, are hit somewhere else, and that's the evidence, then you have the conspiracy. One of the reasons I think people do stay in Dealey Plaza is it's the crime scene. I understand that. And the public has been badly served on this case for a long time in the following way. We have a home movie of the assassination taken by a Dallas dressmaker, Abraham Zapruder, who's trying out his new 8mm Bell & Howell camera that day. And it would be nice to be able to say to the American public a month after, what did you think of that home movie? But you couldn't do that. You could only see stills in Life magazine. So it's not out until 1975 when Geraldo Rivera puts it on his overnight show. That's amazing to me, to think that for 12 years it's not seen here. So people, no wonder that we thought something was wrong. The home movie gives an entirely different perspective to it. And on first viewing, as most Americans have, or people that see it anywhere in the world, the final headshot looks as though Kennedy's shot from the front. I've seen enough Westerns to know that when I shoot you from the front with a pistol, you fall over backwards. And Kennedy's head goes back into the left. I watch it for the first time, and I remember thinking in the 70s I was in law school, and it looks like a front shooter to me. So I see why people stay in Dealey Plaza, and then you get Oliver Stone and others who say, oh, by the way, the bullet that did hit Kennedy and went on to hit the governor, that sort of did some magic tricks in between. Did a somersault, it turned left, it turned right, hesitated for a few seconds, then it went on. So between all of that, people stay stuck there. But I think they spend too much time, because the harder question, in my view, is if you conclude that there was only one assassin, that assassin was behind, that assassin was Oswald, as I then conclude, you still don't know if there's a conspiracy. People believe that if I say the single bullet happened, I think there was no conspiracy. No, it just means that one bullet that was fired hit both of those men. They think that if I say the headshot came from behind, I'm saying there was no conspiracy. No, I'm just saying there was an assassin who fired the fatal headshot. If I then concluded as Oswald was in the 6-4 of the depository, they think that I'm then saying it's no conspiracy. No, you then have to ask the tougher question. Is he doing it for himself, or is he doing it for somebody else? So that's the difficulty of going layer by layer. As you say, logically, you come out of Dealey Plaza, and you still don't have the answer about who killed Kennedy. You may know who the assassin was, but you don't know if it was just him or somebody behind him.
You found that the Warren Commission was flawed in its examination, but came to the right conclusion.
Yeah, the bottom line is Warren Commission got it right in who killed Kennedy. The things the Warren Commission did wrong. And, you know, when I published this book, people thought it was a conspiracy, hated it. They thought I was part of the conspiracy because I was covering up. But the defenders of the Warren Commission also didn't like it because I was criticizing the Warren Commission for its errors. So I was sort of this Johnny-come-lately who was pointing a finger in both directions. And it's not surprising the Warren Commission got some things wrong because there were things they couldn't necessarily prove. They had to guess at the second bullet. They couldn't figure out the timing of the shots unless one bullet hit both Kennedy and Connally. And so it was actually, you know, Specter was then on the commission. Alan Specter later became a senator who came up with the idea that it was one bullet, but they weren't really sure of the proof of that. It took almost 30 years before a group that does forensics work for trials was able to show how that happened and how the bullets slowed up. The Warren Commission also got the sequence wrong. They thought the first bullet hit Kennedy, the second bullet missed, and the third bullet was a headshot. That gave the shooter about 5.5 seconds. Not impossible. The FBI had people recreate those shots, but it was a tight sequence. And as a result, people said, oh, nobody could make that. Oswald couldn't make it. Turns out that it was the first bullet that missed. We now know that almost certainly most people have come to agree with that. Gives the shooter 8.5 to 11.5 seconds, depending on how you look at it. And people forget that the clock starts running when the first bullet is fired, because the bullet is in the chamber. It's a bolt-action rifle. The chamber's loaded, aims, fires, clock starts running, rebolts. The other thing is the Warren Commission didn't aggressively look into Jack Ruby's possible mob contacts, something that's been done since. There may be nothing there, but they didn't really aggressively check that. They failed to realize how important it was to open up files on a regular basis to the American public. They listened instead to the concerns of the Kennedy family, who didn't want them there. They sealed material for years, which gave everybody the suspicions about what happened, right? The autopsy, which was done on the president, has some absolutely indispensable information, like the x-rays and the photographs. But the autopsy itself was not a great autopsy. You would think the autopsy on the president of the United States would be the best possible. It was not. But the Warren Commission didn't point out those sort of problems because Earl Warren was petrified of publishing anything about the autopsy. It could become a gruesome display for the public to use. So there were these missteps along the way that might have been inevitable, but in the end, I think it diminished the work. There was one last thing. Who did the investigation for the Warren Commission? The FBI, who could have been considered a suspect. Right. Later on, many people thought so. The CIA was helping them. And both the CIA and the FBI, they really did a disservice to the American public and to history because they lied to the Warren Commission about different things. The FBI lied about the fact that it had destroyed a note that had been left by Oswald to an agent.
James Hosty.
The J. Edgar Hoover was worried about the fact that somebody would say, hey, you, Hoover, you're the FBI. You had an open file on this guy, Oswald. He had been a defector to the Soviet Union. You had agents who were talking to him in Texas. You didn't know that he had landed a job that was on the motorcade route where the president of the United States was going in front of him. And then they would go from just being an open file to you should have done more to stop the assassination. So Hoover knew it was a fine line. The CIA, on the other hand, they were petrified because Oswald, 6 weeks before the assassination, had been in Mexico City trying to get a visa to travel to Cuba, where he thought the real revolution was. And they and the CIA were afraid that the Warren Commission might find out that the CIA was trying to kill a head of state together with the mafia. But guess what? It wasn't Kennedy, it was Castro, where they had failed 7 times already even to wound him. They didn't want that known, so they kept all of that secret. When, in years later, Nick, the information started to come out about a cover-up to the Warren Commission, people picked up evidence of that. Those reporters thought, correctly so, they must be covering up a murder. They were instead covering up their own bureaucratic plots and inconsistencies, but in the end, it's one of the reasons the Warren Commission looks flawed. Right conclusion, bottom line, got it, but I understand why people have so little faith in it.
Right. What new evidence did you find that helped shape your conclusion?
Well, the new evidence, I wish I could say I was responsible for it. I wasn't, though. I just watched it come out, was actually for an American Bar Association mock trial of who killed Kennedy that was done the year before Pupper's case closed. And they hired a firm called Failure Analysis, which did courtroom work in terms of ballistics and new analysis of you could come in for the defense or the prosecution and show the latest and the greatest. And they did work for both the prosecution and the defense on the Kennedy case. Their breakthrough, though, however, was on the prosecution side, because what they figured out for the first time is how the single bullet happened. And what I mean by that, and that was, of all the things, here I am saying don't get stuck on Dealey Plaza, but then, of course, I'm stuck on Dealey Plaza. So the great part of that is you have a World War II vintage rifle. It's a good killing machine, but it's an old-fashioned military rifle. Fires this 160 grain full metal jacketed bullet. That's what Oswald was using. And when he fires it from the depository, it's fired just about 2,000 feet a second. At the point where the second shot is, it's no guesswork involved anymore because we know it's around frames 223 and 224. There's a Zapruder film because you can see the moment at which the governor is responding half a second later to the shot. And when I say the frame of the film, for those who don't know it, the home movie of the assassination, which is a Zapruder film, is also the time clock for the assassination. It's 18.3 frames a second. So when I say frame 223 to 224, we're talking an 18th of a second. And as you can measure it very, very distinctly. If we didn't have the film, you'd never have anything solved in this case. But in this case, they know when the bullet hits the back of the president, the high neck area, at about 1,500 to 1,600 feet a second, it goes straight through the president without hitting any bone. Exits here on the front, it flies straight through. So small, and we know it's a straight through pass because the doctors who treated the president at Parkland Hospital when he was brought in for an emergency, they didn't flip him over. They only see the wound here before they do the tracheotomy. They said, oh, look at that. That's an entrance wound. They thought that was a small wound. If they had flipped him over, they would have seen an even smaller entrance wound on the back. But that's how tiny. It comes out the president. It then is flipping. The reason I know this with such certainty is not that I'm able to see the bullet, but I'm able to see the entry wound, the photographs on the back of the governor, who's positioned in front of the president a little bit lower and turning around to see what had happened after the first shot, holding his Stetson hat. It's flipping, and it hits the governor, enters him in the shoulder blade area with an 1.25 inch wound. That's the size of the bullet. So the bullet hits him on the side, slows the bullet up a little bit more. It cracks a rib as it comes down through his chest. At that point, 1,200 feet a second, enough to crack the rib. When it comes out under his left nipple and goes into the wrist, it's hitting the wrist at about 900 feet a second, which is enough to break the bone, but not enough to deform the bullet completely. And then it plots, as I call it, plot may not be the right word, but comes into his thigh at about 400 feet, enough to get in and under the skin, but not enough to make it so deep that it doesn't pop out when they're moving him around on the emergency rooms at Parkland. Now, somebody says to me, or failure analysis, great theory. How do we know that's true?
Right.
So they took 2 people, cadavers the size of Kennedy and Connally, and they put them in the equivalent of the car at the same space and location, and the shots fired with 6.5 millimeter the Carcano bullets. And all day long now, they're able to recreate that shot and the damage on that bullet. I reprint in the book a copy of one of those bullets that was done. That work, which was new and was really not covered at all by the press, covered in case closed, to me, settles the question of the single bullet. No matter what else you want to say, although it didn't settle for a lot of people, still hold on to it. They can't give it up. One shooter firing from behind the president that day fired one shot that inflicted those sets of wounds on those two men, and is the bullet that is now called CE-399. So that was new. And the other thing that was new in the book was that I have a chapter on him. I interviewed Yuri Nosenko, who was a Soviet defector.
Oswald's handler.
Oswald's handler handled the Oswald case, and in Russia, he said, you know what, we thought he was crazy. We wanted him out of the country. And the thing with Nosenko that was interesting, and this is for every researcher, every writer, anybody who's doing a book, you think to yourself, and it's really Tricia, my wife, who always says to me, send a letter, request it. The worst thing they can do is ignore it or say no. I requested to interview Jackie Kennedy. She had never interviewed with anybody about the assassination. She was working at Doubleday at the time. She ignored it. She never answered. That's to be expected. But I sent a letter to the CIA Information Office in Langley saying, will you please forward this letter to Yuri Nosenko, who was a Soviet defector, who at first the CIA thought he was a fake defector. They kept him in a house. They tortured him for years. He lost part of his vision in his eye. Then they realized he was a real defector. They released him, put him in the equivalent of witness protection. He's living somewhere in America, we think, but we don't know. I don't assume name. Don't even know if he's alive. In '92, I sent a letter saying, please forward this to Nosenko if you can. Nothing happens. A few months later, get a note back from the CIA saying, Mr. Nosenko's willing to meet with you. But you have to pay for his travel. I said, all right. And then they came back and they said, no, we don't want you to pay for his travel, because if you pay for his travel, you'll know by the cost of the airfare probably where he's living. So instead, he's going to come to CIA headquarters and you can meet him here. And that'll be it. That's where I met him. We got along so well that we then went to dinner with Tricia and his wife in a Virginia restaurant. And I said to him, why have you agreed to talk to me when you have never talked to anybody else about the Kennedy assassination? And he said, because you're the first person who asked since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. I was always afraid they were going to kill me. Now it's over. I feel safe. He had come out of the shadows. So sometimes it's the luck of when you ask. Sure. But for conspiracy theorists who think that case closed must be a complete CIA operation to cover up the truth, the fact that I was able to talk to Yuri Nosenko is further evidence of the fact the CIA must have cooperated at a high level. They should only know how simple it was for anybody to get that interview.
Really, the timing of it.
Timing is indispensable, right? But it's so, and I think that the other thing was, this may seem a strange answer to you, but what was new in the book, forget the single bullet and forget Nosenko. If you ask me what the most important thing was, sometimes people say, what is it that convinces you more than anything that this is the right conclusion? It's the first third of the book or thereabouts. It's a biography of Oswald.
Yep.
That biography of Oswald for sure got it. Yes, the Warren Commission covered much of that in detail, but not in light of what conspiracy theorists had said over the years he had done. So Oswald had become a stick figure. He became the figure in Oliver Stone's film or in many of the books in which he's just sort of this patsy. Yep. He's not capable of doing much. He's been set up. He doesn't know what hit him. And it's easy to believe that. But once you get to understand Oswald and understand this inexorable march to November 22nd, 1963. So I think that for many people, I can't tell you how many people would stop me and say, wow, your stuff on Oswald blew me away. And I said, well, there's nothing really new there in that sense. But it was new in the sense that it had been forgotten.
It just doesn't get picked up by the mainstream. We were talking a little bit off camera. What really turned the page for me was his assassination attempt on General Edwin Walker at his Highland Park home in Dallas a mere 7 months before the JFK assassination, misses him just, by inches. And we're talking about how it still is separate from the event, but it establishes the behavior of this man.
There's no question. I mean, if somebody all of a sudden decide to go from Thursday to Friday to become an assassin. It's an unusual move. Happens sometimes, but rare. There's some sign in their past. Now, Oswald's politics, he had this left-wing mix of politics with a little bit of anarchy in them, but you're absolutely right. The key thing for me is that he had decided by the early spring of 1963, only months before Kennedy is killed, that he is going to change history by committing himself to political assassination. And the target is not an elected leader, but somebody that he sees as a threat to the future. This retired Army General, Edwin Walker, who had run for the governorship of Texas and lost, but was thinking of doing it again. To Oswald, he's sort of like a future type of Hitler, possibly. Oswald's going to stop Hitler from coming into play. He's going to stop Walker. And Marina, Lee Oswald's wife, who knew about the attempted assassination after the fact, Lee told her, was so worried that he was going to try to do it again, that he wasn't going to give up, that she had him leave Dallas. They moved to New Orleans for the time. Not where Oswald had family, not because she wanted to be in New Orleans, but she wanted to be away from Walker. And even when Oswald comes back from Mexico City 6 weeks before the assassination, he's going to Walker rallies again. He's on to Walker. So this is somebody who's shown he's ready to make an assassination to change the course of history. And Kennedy, we can talk about this at any time, sort of arrives on his plate on a silver platter. It's a gift, as it would be.
Yes, absolutely. I believe in business you call it a bluebird when those moments happen.
Yeah, and you know, that's because I think that's important for people who don't know the case. They must think that in order to kill a president of the United States, an assassin would have to have such a hatred about that president. They would really want them dead. They'd have to be, if it was against President Obama or President Biden or President Trump, Islamic extremist, anti-abortion, pro-abortion. It would have to be somebody who's against the U.S. government or, Oswald didn't have a particular hatred for Kennedy. He hated the system. He hated capitalism. He hated what America stood for. He'd also come to hate what Russia stood for because he believed in communism. But when he defected there, he thought that the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union had ruined the original pureness of the Communist Manifesto. That's why he was intrigued about going to Cuba. The real revolution was happening with Castro. So Oswald ends up landing a job in Dallas through a friend of his wife's who calls up and is looking for a job because Lee needs some work, and they find it at a book depository. The book depository could put him outside of downtown Dallas at a location or put him downtown. They put him at the downtown location. At that time, nobody had set the motorcade route for the President of the United States who's visiting in a few weeks. When that route is finally set, people forget. Today we have security. We don't know where the President is stopping in each and every point. We don't know those spontaneous moments when they get out of the motorcade and mix with the crowd. Then the motorcade route was given in both Dallas newspapers, the Dallas Herald and the Dallas Morning News. Oswald could have read it on November the 19th when it was published the first time, 3 days before the assassination. He had a habit, because he had very little money and was very tight-fisted, of day-old newspapers in the cafeteria of his workplace. He might have read it on the 20th in the day-old paper. In any case, he finds out only 2 or 3 days beforehand. It's the night before the assassination. He goes back to visit his wife, who's staying with their friend Ruth Payne out in Irving, Texas, because he has to collect his rifle. Doesn't tell them that. So the thing that people ask is, do you mean to tell me that the idea to kill the president only came when he learned of the motorcade route? That it's possible that you could be committed to assassination at that last second without having planned for it for a long time? And that absolutely is the way that Oswald operates. It's Oswald's DNA. It was an opportunity that he was ready to seize. But I think it's critical to know from the Oswald that I came to understand, it wasn't a suicide mission. Lee thought of himself, he had just turned 24 the month before, for great achievement in the future, whatever that was. And he was not strapping a bomb on himself and walking into the place to try to blow it up. If he didn't know what a presidential motorcade security entailed, he didn't know if the Secret Service would have people in the buildings where he worked. he couldn't be sure that his coworkers who left him half an hour earlier to go to have lunch wouldn't stay up on the 6th floor to watch the motorcade with him. Or maybe when he went to the window to set up the sniper's nest, there were people in the adjoining buildings who were just as tall as the Texas School Book Depository, or were looking right in on him. If he was not able to take that shot and think that he could get away, my feeling is he was taking that rifle home again. He wasn't going to even try to shoot the president. So everything has to break correctly for him.
Yes.
But the Oswald that I got to understand could have been on the 6th floor of a building in downtown Moscow, shooting at Nikita Khrushchev, who was head of the Soviet Union. He was ready to throw this cog into the machinery of government. He did it here by killing President Kennedy, and it was the one great achievement for a person who had otherwise been pretty much a loser most of his life. I mean, he had finally done it, and we're talking about him 60 years later. He would be the happiest of all about that.
And you mentioned lucky breaks. This fatal headshot, the third shot, nearly misses, correct? It is that close of a degree that President Kennedy is saved, and there's no fatal headshot.
I hesitate for a second because I can't tell you how many times I've watched the Zapruder film too many times. And this may sound corny, but there's a moment at the beginning of watching the Zapruder film where I still get this feeling like sometimes I just want the car to stop. I want them to get a flat tire. I want them to turn around and make the turn because I know what's coming. You know what is coming and how that film plays out. And the bad part of that is, so we know the headshot. So the first shot misses, the limousine comes around and starts to move toward the depository. People sometimes ask, why didn't Oswald take that shot? Wouldn't that have been the easiest shot as the car's moving toward? Actually, for shooters, when you talk to shooters, and I'm not a great gamesman, a hunter or shooter, but a target that's dropping under your line of vision is a tougher shot to hit than a shot that's moving away, where you are able to keep your scope on the target in a direct line. But Oswald doesn't take that shot. There's another reason. He has to reposition the sniper's nest so that he's directly facing out of the depository, and then he is in the view of the Dow Techs and other buildings that are looking in. The way that he has set up the sniper's nest, he's really partially hidden. You can see him if you're looking up from part of the Dealey Plaza, but it's not an easy spot. So he's put himself in a spot where it's not so easy, except for the rifle sticking out there for a bit, which people really don't see because they're all looking at the president. And as that first shot misses, there's a tree in between Oswald and that car's the hardest angle for the shot to take place. The car isn't hit by it. Likely hits some part of the tree. The FBI never went up and used a cherry picker to look if that tree and it goes out 500 feet of the depository and wounds a bystander. Oswald then has to recock 3.5 seconds to the next shot, which is the so-called single bullet. That takes that shot, not fatal. Kennedy would survive that shot. Now, after that, he has to recock. The bullet comes out. He aims again. And when you say the headshot, the reason that's the most frustrating, he has the most time, 5 to 6 seconds between those two shots. He's looking at the president. At the point of the headshot, the 4-power scope makes it look as though he's 25 yards away. It's fairly close. Head's pretty large. The driver of the limousine is the oldest member of the security detail, William Greer. He was 52 years old. He tells the Warren Commission, I heard the first shot. I looked around to see what was happening because I knew something was wrong, and I saw the president reacting, which was wrong because he wasn't reacting to the first shot. I turned back around, and I was hitting the gas to accelerate out of Dealey Plaza the moment I heard this terrible sound in the back, and that was the headshot. That's very dramatic. It's not true, though. And the reason I say it's not true, testimony is good, but it's the best evidence is the tape. And the Zapruder film shows that Greer didn't turn around after the first shot. He turned around after the second shot when the president was hit. So the car, which had been going around 11 miles an hour, it's a slow-moving motorcade, slows now as Greer goes to look at the president. And Greer turns back around. As he's turning back around, Kennedy's in a back brace. It's easy to forget that. He had a bad back. He's in the back brace. It's keeping him propped up a little bit. His head rolled a little to the left side. Mrs. Kennedy, if you look at the film carefully, is putting his arms have reflexively come up in this neurological response to the first shot, even though nothing was hit here. It still caused this little trauma part. And she's pressing down on his left elbow to try to bring it down, and it's not coming down. And the car is now slowed to 5 to 6 miles an hour. Oswald, 5 seconds from behind the president's in the scope, takes the shot on the car that's making no evasive move at all, and still, as you said, almost misses. Hits in the high right rear portion of the head. An inch and a half higher, the president lives, but that's the nature of assassinations. And it's so frustrating because there's no doubt, how do we know it's speculative, but if the car had been making an evasive move, there's no way the shooter pulls off the headshot. There's so many possibilities, but that's how it has to break for us, an assassination to be successful. And we know that that's how history works, unfortunately.
You read about, for example, the Reagan attempted assassination, and a few inches, might have differently, and it might have killed President Reagan.
A couple of inches over, and that was death for President Reagan. When George Wallace was shot, we know that Bremer was having trouble getting through the crowd to get to Wallace, and then Wallace came back to see a baby that was there and gave Brenner the shot. Otherwise, Brenner never even gets the chance. Bobby Kennedy, the night that he's killed, wanted to go through the front of the hotel originally. That was the original plan in the Ambassador Hotel after he won the California primary, to enjoy and savor the moment, but it was so late, it was midnight. When the results came in, they decided at the last moment, let's just forget about it and go out the back. Sirhan was in the kitchen area. If they hadn't, they would have never run into Sirhan. So we never know in American history how many times a potential assassin may have gone to a political rally armed with a pistol, or sitting in a building with a rifle, hoping to get a shot at a candidate that they disliked or for whatever reason wanted to kill, and never got that opportunity because it didn't work out. The bubble top on the limousine was not bulletproof. I understood it was made bullet resistant to that or whatever afterwards. So, and they spent $500,000 on making the limousine more rugged. But if that bubble top had been on that day, maybe there would have been a reflection from the sun that would have stopped the shooter from being able to pull it off. You don't know that. If the Secret Service was riding along the sideboards, would that have blocked the view of the shooter and made it more difficult? It's the what if, but in the end, you're left with what happened. And one of the things that I come back to, and this is sort of the logic of it. So I've had people earnestly debate with me for a long time over the fact that they believe that the gun that Oswald had was just a junky rifle, and how could it have pulled off the assassination? My point is that we know that ballistically, they've done neutron activation tests on the bullets in the House Select Committee in the late 70s to test the bullets. We know that the bullet fragments found in the car, which were from the headshot, and the single bullet that wounded both men, they came from one gun at the exclusion of everything else. They came from Oswald's rifle. No matter who killed Kennedy that day, they used that rifle. If you want to say it was a world-class assassin, they still had to use that junky rifle. So that Carcano and those bullets were the ones that hit the targets that day. Now, you want to argue about whether it was Oswald or somebody else? Fine. But you can't eliminate the gun from the murder. And so, it's sort of a process where I say I'm willing to entertain any argument, but at some point you have to use the evidence to figure out what you want to argue.
So on the topic of evidence, one area that I've been really curious about is what conspiracy theorists claim was the last-minute change of the president's motorcycle formation for his limousine for the parade that day in Dallas. Typically, on presidential motorcades, the president is flanked on each side by two motorcyclists in what is known as the standard wedge formation. Looking at the footage that day of the Zapruder film, the standard wedge was removed, and instead they had more of a wide open formation, placing about 4 motorcycles behind the president's car, leaving him completely vulnerable. What do you make of that?
Yeah, Dallas wasn't the only time the president was completely vulnerable, in which the motorcycles were pushed back. And that was really a call made by the White House in the end, because the White House has to decide for political purposes what the trip is for and how they want the president that day to be presented to the public. That long motorcade down Main Street that then is on the way to the trademark had two things that were different than what you would have wanted if you were really looking at good security. The 4 motorcycles around the car, which were pulled back so that the car was on its own. Occasionally, the Secret Service would get on the sideboards. There are some pictures of them with that, and then they would get off at other times. But once the motorcade gets going down Main Street, they really aren't there on those sideboards. That is a question I've often asked myself. If it's not the idea there was no last-minute changes owing to the conspiracy, all of a sudden we said, oh, by the way, we've got to make sure that we have the president open and vulnerable so the shot can be had, and that'll be the end of it. But if the motorcycle had been in its traditional formation of 4 motorcycles around the car, that wouldn't have changed a rear shooter shooting from the position of where Oswald was.
Right.
Might have affected a front shooter, the Phantom Grassy Knoll shooter, if there had been one, but that's a shooter that I don't think ever existed, despite all the speculation. The Secret Service on the sideboards might have affected the view of the shooter from the back. So could security have been better that day? Absolutely. Was there a last-minute change where all of a sudden something that was set in stone had been turned around? No, but it's been said so many times and repeated so many times that the idea of a last-minute change to the motorcade route is set in stone for many people.
And what of the House Select Committee with this acoustical evidence saying that there was not 3 shots, but in fact 4 shots fired? We have this dictabelt recording.
I think that's one of the reasons when I was in law school. So I'm graduating from law school the year that they came to the conclusion that there was a 95% certainty of a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination. Boy, that seemed pretty conclusive to me. I felt my idea about the mob had to be right, because this is a 3-year government investigation that came to that conclusion. That was the headline and seemed very, very persuasive. I remember hearing, didn't know the details, that they had found a police dictabelt that was from a motorcycle, that was a motorcycle that had its mic stuck in the on position and had inadvertently recorded the sounds of the assassination, therefore the gunshots, and the dictabelt that was recording all of the police communications, therefore had been examined by experts for the Select Committee and picked up evidence of 4 shots. Case closed. 4 shots, conspiracy. Only later, when I listened to the dictabelt, and this is years later, it was actually put out in a magazine on a little 45 for the first time, and you listen to the dictabelt and you wait for the shots. Now you get to the spot where the shots are, and here's what you hear. Nothing. I expect to hear actual gunfire. You don't hear that because there's no gunfire over the period in which the Select Committee says shots took place. What the sound experts said, who were hired by the Select Committee at the very end of their work when they were running out of money, and they had done some great work. The Select Committee did some fantastic work on debunking many of the false stories and claims. Then this comes up at the very end. They said, oh, well, we don't hear any shots, but we see these sort of impulses, these sonic impulses that are taking place on the dictabelt. That is the equivalent of the shot. And there are 4 of them just around the time the Kennedys killed. That's the proof that he's killed. Great idea. National Academy of Sciences takes it, examines it, and says, no, not quite. We think you're at the wrong spot. You're a minute and a half too early. And then other experts come in over time. The person whose mic was in the open position, we now have pretty good evidence, wasn't even at Dealey Plaza. May have been far away from it. You can hear a bell at one point tolling, may have been closer to the trademark. So the unfortunate part was twofold. First of all, the Select Committee, which did some great work, is remembered just for that. And it's unfortunate because it sullied a lot of their work later on. But secondly, they created the absolute impression that the government had concluded that there was an overwhelming possibility of a second shooter, or at least a conspiracy. And although it's now been fairly debunked, there are still people that hold on to the acoustics material. And I know that it takes time and detail to go through it, but it is what I call one of the most unfortunate mistakes. So here's what it comes down to in the end. I'm not a betting person. I don't go and bet on the horses or anything else. But if somebody said to me, that horse has a 95% chance of winning, I'd probably bet on that horse.
Sure.
But the 5% comes through sometimes. Sometimes the long shot wins. And in this case, the 5% came through on those experts. They thought it was a 95% chance of conspiracy. It's now been proven just the opposite. They had the tapes wrong. They had the material wrong. They're lucky they gave themselves some window because the 5% turned out to be the truth.
Right. So I want to bring to your attention what is referred to by conspiracy theorists as the smoking gun or the Katzenbach Memo. And so this is a verbatim copy of a Justice Department memo from then acting Attorney General of the United States, Nicholas Katzenbach, to new President Lyndon Johnson's aide, Bill Moyers. A bit of background on the memo. This was sent 3 days after the assassination, on the day of John F. Kennedy's funeral. Katzenbach had written it within hours of Lee Harvey Oswald's murder by Jack Ruby. And to quote, Katzenbach states, "The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who were still at large, and that the evidence was such that he would have been convicted at trial." Katzenbach later admitted that he knew very little at this stage, and today conspiracy theorists argue that the memo is clearly advocating a political agenda, irrespective of the investigation that followed. What do you make of the memo and why today many believe it provides the blueprint for a cover-up?
So I understand why people point at this memo and say, oh, there it is. There's the government telling everybody to fall into line. And I'll tell you why it should be so simple, but it's not quite as good as that theory. First of all, I mean, the first line of the memo is often not quoted. It is important that all the facts surrounding President Kennedy's assassination be made public. Yes, he does go on then to think it's Oswald, but at that time, 3 days afterwards, most of the people in the country thought that the assassin had been caught and unfortunately killed by Jack Ruby, and that was unfortunate. The FBI in Hoover thought that it was Oswald who was the shooter. They thought by the rifle and the ballistic that they had found their person. Katzenbach was saying, you think it's Oswald, then you better be able to get that out and stop the speculation, because there was already speculation of, are the Soviets behind it? What they were worried about in the government wasn't a finger being pointed at the FBI or the CIA. They were worried that this could kick off World War III. What if Lee Harvey Oswald, who had lived in Russia, was doing it as a Russian agent? What if he had ties to Castro, who he was going down to try to see? He had a pro-Cuba organization when he was in New Orleans in the summer of '63. If there was a tie in the middle of the Cold War a year earlier, we had the standoff on the Cuban Missile Crisis, we would be at war with Russia. So if it's Oswald, you better settle this case, wrap it up with a neat bow, and make sure that it's done. Now, was it inartfully said? Yes. Katzenbach, when he was later, before the House Select Committee was questioned under oath, said, have you ever had anything, I think he said it to one of the senators, that you wrote that you wish you could take back and write in a different way? Yes, I wish I could have done that. There's something else to remember, though, about this memo. Katzenbach was the acting Attorney General. You said it in the question. So he'd been the Deputy Attorney General. Who was Attorney General? Bobby Kennedy. He had resigned. He was grieving for his brother. He came back in December and regained the role. So are we to assume for a second, assume the most nefarious from this, that Nick Katzenbach has decided he's been brought into this massive internal government conspiracy, make sure that we have Oswald pinned for the murder, and wrap up all the details. So first, he puts it into a memo to President Johnson's press person. Okay, that's interesting. Bill Moyers, who's over there, not to the head of the CIA or anybody else. He sends over to the Johnson administration on what will be a public information record at some point. All right, he makes that mistake. So he sends it out. He's in the conspiracy, but Bobby Kennedy's coming back to take over. Nobody thinks Bobby's in a conspiracy to cover up the truth about his brother's murder. Bobby's going to find out about what Nick's done and send him into jail if he's done that, but has no offense. There's another thing is the FBI is under the Justice Department's control. So if Katzenbach is trying to get a conspiracy to frame Oswald and make sure it's Oswald and nothing else is looked at, you would keep the investigation under the FBI because then you have control over the Bureau. But what is Nick Katzenbach doing in the subsequent weeks to this? He's the one urging the president to establish an independent commission. He's the one set up the Warren Commission, which is independent from the Justice Department, which he has no control over. So it's the logic of looking at this memo in terms of what people thought at that time. Yes, they thought it was Oswald, and saying, let's get all the information out and cut off all the speculation. But is it in order to cover up in light of everything else you think of? And it just doesn't have that force. I'm amazed that it has stood the test of time to be such a sort of a point that conspiracy theorists still point out. And when I say to them, but Bobby Kennedy was coming back in a couple of months, they say, oh yeah, that's right. And he had no control over the Warren Commission. And what about the fact that it was a public memo sent to this? So you always have to look at it in its context, I think. I don't think that it was Nick Katzenbach's finest moment, but and he would have written it differently if he had the ability to. But I don't think this is the evidence that the government was ready to fail to do an adequate investigation. One other thing, Lyndon Johnson. What do they always say in a crime show? In a crime show, let's get a list of the suspects who have the most to gain. That would mean, Nick, any presidential assassination, top suspect has to be the vice president. Vice president automatically has the most to gain. They're becoming president in that sense. And so if that's the case, then LBJ be considered a suspect. But LBJ also thought it was a conspiracy. He thought Castro was behind it. So he watched it all play out. But he and other government leaders, much higher pay grade than Nick Katzenbach, were worried what would happen if the evidence didn't show that the Russians or the Cubans were involved, because it would set off a tinderbox of a response. So there's no doubt that they were hoping it's a simple case. This guy who we think killed the president ended up doing it on his own. And when the Warren Commission came to that conclusion, I think there were people in Washington who were relieved that it wasn't a wider plot that tied to the Russians.
So another area I'm interested in understanding involves the presidential limo. So it arrives at Parkland Hospital. This would be considered crucial crime scene evidence. But it appears that the brain matter and blood were washed off pretty quickly before the president had even been pronounced dead. What do you think of the Secret Service and why they were so quick to clean the limo and shortly thereafter ship it off to Detroit for a makeover?
So I think that, first of all, crime scene handling, right? We think of crime scene, it was a crime scene, and that car certainly was as well. But I think the Secret Service, they had just lost the person that they were responsible for. So it's hard to imagine what it was like for them that day, and in the Dallas police as well, and at Parkland Hospital. But the story about the car, the limousine being washed at Parkland, clearly is incorrect. Well, here's why I say that. There was a Dallas motorcycle policeman who walked over to the car, and his testimony is the one that we sort of remember for this, because he said that he looked inside. Mrs. Kennedy had been given a bouquet of roses when she arrived that day in Dallas. When he looked in, there were on the back seat and on the floorboard puddles of blood, and in one of the little puddles of blood was a rose. And he said, I remembered that because it was so heart-wrenching. Now, one of the assistants to a nurse was told to get the car washed inside because it was so messy they didn't want photographers from the press going over and taking pictures of it. There's even a picture of a bucket next to the car at one point with two Dallas policemen, looks like a Secret Service person, trying to put a fabric top over the top of the car so that it's hidden. The nurse's assistant, when asked later, by the way, did you wash the car? Did you get someone to wash it? She said, it was so crazy on everything happening, I forgot to do it. So what was cleaned evidently by the time the car, which was flown back and put into FBI custody way before it goes to the Ford Museum, was the driver's seat, which was cleaned off so that the car could actually be driven from the spot where it gets off the transport into the location. But the rest of the car has pictures taken in the National Archives of the back of that car, which are blood splattered. There's a rose in the back of the car that hasn't yet been moved. And I'm sure that there's somebody out there who thinks they put a new rose in and it's a different shade of something else. But the idea that they were going to clean the car, yes. They had even suggested to somebody, they had put a bucket next to it. That's crazy on its own. And if they had thoroughly washed the car down and the inside at that moment, you would think that I'm not just worried about blood being picked up in that, but I'm worried about bullet fragments and other things. The bullet fragments that were recovered weren't recovered at the scene in Dallas. They recovered on the actual forensics examination of the limousine once it's been given back from the Secret Service to the FBI when the FBI is combing over it before it goes to court. There they find the little cracks. They find the fragments on the floorboard. They put together that part of the bullet from the head that exploded out. So the car, yes, almost washed, but not washed. But the idea that it was washed and the bucket by the car immediately feeds the idea that they must have been hiding something. There's a story that goes along with this that is partially related, which is there's testimony from one Dallas policeman and maybe one person in Parkland says, I saw a hole in the windshield. And I'm sure bullet hole through the windshield means, oh, that bullet couldn't have been coming from behind, because the bullet that went into Kennedy and Connally, the single bullet, never went to the windshield. The bullet that hit the president's head, fragmented and destroyed, didn't go into the windshield. So that meant somebody firing from the front or somebody else firing from behind. Turns out that was photographed. They went through that. The windshield on that car had 2 sheets of glass. Was the only part that was a little secure. The crack actually comes from a fragment that hits the inside, pushes the inside glass up toward the front of the glass, forms a little hairline crack. You can see all of that. That's there, but it gets in testimony to be more than that. So there are stories around the limousine that day, but the cleaning story, the bucket is there, but it was not in fact used.
Interesting. So there have been a lot of opinions over the last 6 decades on the assassination. Initially, I was impressed with Mark Lane when he first came out, and he was highly entertaining, made a lot of people very suspicious at the government. But none, however, seemed to create a bigger spectacle than Jim Garrison in New Orleans. Tell me about Jim Garrison, who's portrayed really as the protagonist in Oliver Stone's film JFK.
Yeah, you're right. Mark Lane was the first with Rush to Judgment. Great title. But Mark Lane wanted to be the attorney for Oswald. Then Oswald was killed, so he was the attorney for Oswald's mother. And I read Mark Lane's book very much as an attorney for the defense. He made the case for the dead victim, for Oswald, that he would have made in a court of law. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't presenting both sides. He was just presenting the one side of the attack, and he did it very well. But people read it and thought that's real history. So as a result, he was responsible for kicking off, in many ways, the conspiracy theories. They didn't realize they were reading the defense case for Oswald, but that was fine. Now you all of a sudden get in the late 60s, not just a writer, not just somebody who says I would want to be his attorney, but a sitting district attorney in a city in which Oswald had been only months before the assassination, handing out leaflets for a pro-Castro organization, running into anti-Castro activists in a town that was full of intrigue. So here you have Jim Garrison, district attorney in New Orleans, a city that Oswald had been at only months before the assassination. New Orleans with all types of intrigue. Carlos Marcello, head of the mafia there, kicked out of the country by the Kennedys before he comes back to the United States, hates Jack Kennedy. Oh, could Marcello be involved in a plot to kill the president with maybe Santo Trafficante in Florida, sure, and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs? What about Sam Giancana, head of the mafia in Chicago? They certainly hated the Kennedys. Maybe it was a mob family. So that Garrison was going to get to the bottom of this. And he was very high profile. He gave an interview in Playboy magazine. The conspiracy theorists at the time all went to work for him as volunteers. And Garrison came up with a story that was worthy of a novel. It was fantastic. It involved this unusual sort of freelance pilot, David Ferry, who had been in the Civil Air Patrol at a time when Oswald was 15 years old and had been in it. It involved one of the most important people in New Orleans, who was a member of the gay community there, and it involved sightings of Oswald together with other people, including an ex-FBI agent. It was a fantastic stew. The problem is, it just was fake. We now know that. As a matter of fact, the anger that I have over Jim Garrison isn't that he made a mistake. Prosecutor can make a mistake. He can have evidence, she can have evidence that they think lead to a crime. Investigated, that's what they're supposed to do. They sometimes bring charges that turn out to be wrong and the person's acquitted. But there was a certain point at which Garrison knew that the case he was making was based on false evidence. I think I talk about it in my book, and other books since then have explained it out in detail. I think he should have been prosecuted before he died for the crime of a bad prosecution. But he was a true believer. He really honestly believed that there had been a conspiracy in the murder of the president, and he was going to uncover it, even if it meant that he had to trample on some innocent people getting to the truth. Now, the part of that that's so particularly maddening is that by the time Oliver Stone did his film in 1990 and started to do the research on it, Garrison had been abandoned his theories by even the research community. There were very few that stood up for Garrison. They knew that it had been totally discredited. But Oliver Stone needed what Hollywood filmmakers need. They need a hero. Steven Spielberg tells the story of the Holocaust through Oskar Schindler.
Yes.
Helps save people. You need a heroic figure. You don't want to just tell the dark side of the story. There's no heroic figure in the Kennedy assassination except for this fellow out in New Orleans who's trying to uncover the truth, if he was really doing that. And so Stone sort of made him Kevin Costner. He gave him a second life, and he put some,
tied a John Williams score to it.
That's right.
Amazing cinematography.
And to me, it was just a bastardization of history. Now, 90% of people are going to watch a 3-hour movie and get their entire version of history rather than read books about it. I understand that. So the film will have more impact than anything else. But Garrison's probe, while electrifying the country in the late 60s, later turned out to be one of the great fake prosecutions of modern American history.
What I loved in Case Closed is a lot of Garrison's investigation tied to these leaflets that he's handing out in New Orleans at 544 Camp Street, which then opened up, seemed like a labyrinth of puzzles and mazes connected to Guy Bannister and a lot of different characters there.
So there's no question, I always say, that in the Kennedy assassination, there are plenty of things that if you dropped into it without knowing anything about the case and you went through it all, you'd say, oh yeah, that looks a little suspicious. Let me find out more about that. That's an odd coincidence. To believe that Oswald did the assassination not as I do, you have to believe in coincidence a little bit. There are some people who say, I believe in no coincidence. There's no such thing as coincidence. So I understand that. I have an unusual, I think it's an unusual view of this. People think that because I say Oswald alone killed Kennedy, that I'm also saying there was no conspiracy to kill Kennedy. No, I'm saying there was no conspiracy behind Oswald. I'm not saying there was no conspiracy out there to kill the president. There could be right now, as we're talking, a conspiracy to kill President Biden that just hasn't been acted on. Maybe there were some against President Obama or President Trump. They never happened. The mob could have gotten together. You could come in and give me a tape recording of Carlos Marcello sitting around a table saying, let's kill that no-good SOB. And maybe they made steps to do it. I'm saying in Case Closed that Oswald was not their shooter. He got there before them. Maybe there were disgruntled people in the CIA, or there were people in Castro's government that said, hey, the CIA is trying to kill Castro. Let's kill Kennedy first. So those plots could be there. People assume that if there are people that want the president dead and are plotting to do it, and then somebody pulls off the assassination, they must be working for them. But no, you need to establish that. And the reason that New Orleans becomes much less important to me is, let's assume for a second that Oswald was involved in a tremendous conspiracy in New Orleans with all types of unsavory people. I'll tell you one thing without any question, no question about it. It couldn't have been killing the president in Dallas, because nobody knew he was going to Dallas, because the trip hadn't been set when Oswald was living in New Orleans. As a matter of fact, when he gets on a bus, a Trailway bus, on September the 25th, to start the process, Marina goes back to Dallas. Oswald's going down to Mexico City to go to the Soviet embassy and the Cuban consulate to get a visa to go to Cuba. He gets on a bus to travel from New Orleans on the night of September the 25th. Why is that important? It's an overnight trip. He doesn't get down there to the 26th. September the 25th turns out to be, by coincidence, the day that the White House announces for the first time publicly the President of the United States, John Kennedy, is going to go to Dallas for a political trip in November. They don't give the exact dates that he'll be in each city or what he's visiting. So any idea of a plot to kill the president in Texas couldn't be formed before September the 25th. Now, Oswald tries to go to Mexico City. He fails. He's turned away. He returns to Dallas dejected in the beginning of October. Somebody has to bring Oswald into a plot in the remaining 6 weeks to kill the president, because now the date is set that the president will be there on November 22nd. So everything that happens in Oswald's life, including his handing out of Fair Play for Cuba leaflets that have 524, 544 Camp Street stamped on the back, happened before there's any idea of the president, the time, the place, or sense of conspiracy. So my challenge to conspiracy theorists is to say, all right, take whatever you want about Oswald's past before September 25th of 1963 and show me how they brought him into the plot to kill the president when he returned to America in early October from Mexico City. They can't do it by telepathy. They can't do it by secret text. There's no what's up. They have to meet him or talk to him. Where's the meeting? Who's the person? How does he get brought into it? And that's where everybody stumbles. They can't do it. So they focus on the earlier material. They say, oh, look what he was doing here in 62. Oh, look what he was doing in New Orleans. Fine. He was an unusual guy. No doubt about it. Now tell me how that relates to November 22nd, 1963.
Exactly. Let's return to Oswald for a moment. Immediately after the president has been shot, he exits the 6th floor Texas School Book Depository. What happens next?
One of my favorite things about Oswald leaving the depository is conspiracy theorists believe that Jack Ruby killed him 2 days later because he had to be silenced. Now, you only silence somebody if they know something about the assassination. Doesn't mean maybe they did it. They brought in the rifle. They know something. Because if he's really just a patsy, you don't have to kill him. He's set up for the crime. He doesn't know what hit him. He's going to be convicted, and the rest of his life he's going to be sitting in jail and saying, how did they do that? What happened? So he knows something, you've got to kill him. So Oswald, after the assassination, really gives them the slip. You know how he gets out of the depository? Through the front door. Boy, I guess the conspirators had planned for everything. They pulled off the perfect crime, but nobody covered the front door of the depository. So he walks out the front door. By the way, he's the only employee at the depository who left after the... And why is that important? Because if you know Lee Harvey Oswald, the one thing you can say about it without any question is he was obsessed about politics. He thought he was very bright. He thought he knew about politics. He discussed them all the time. He's a political junkie. And if he heard, he said later, after he was arrested, well, I heard the president had been shot. So I thought, oh, great. Rest of the day must be off, so I'll leave. The Lee Harvey Oswald that you get to know, if he had thought the president was shot, would have been out in Dealey Plaza saying, what happened? Trying to talk to people to find out. He's the last person who would have left Dealey Plaza. But instead, he says days off. He leaves Dealey Plaza. He goes out and he gets a taxi. Why is that important? Because I told you he read day-old newspapers because he was trying to save money. He never spent money. Getting in a taxi is the first time we ever think in Oswald's life he did that. That was real money. But the traffic was so heavy around the depository, he said, the hell with this, gets out and gets on a bus, which was actually quicker, to go where? To go back to the rooming house where he lived with other people. He wasn't living on his own. And why did he go to his rooming house? To get his pistol, which he had to pick up. He hadn't brought it with him to the depository. Well, you need that if you don't know anything about what happened in the case. I don't think so. Another sign of flight, of guilt, and he's then walking very fast. We don't know where. That's one of the mysteries of the assassination that I can't answer and no one else can. Lee Harvey Oswald had a plan in his own warped mind for getting away. He had a plan for how he thought he could get out of Dallas and be free. Now, whether it was getting back to Mexico City and saying to the Cubans, look what I've done now, give me a visa, he had some idea. But we don't know where he was going because a Dallas policeman stopped him based upon an all-points bulletin that had been put out that day. Didn't think he had a suspect because the protocol was if you thought you had a suspect, you called it in and said, I'm stopping somebody, and you came out with your pistol. You stopped somebody based on the general description as 3 other cars had earlier that day in the 40 minutes from the time of the assassination because the general description of young white male, dark hair fit. Oswald was doing something that seemed odd to J.D. Tippit. Tippit gets out of the car and Oswald then shoots him dead in front of a whole range of witnesses. So you want to contest the Kennedy assassination? Pretty hard to contest the J.D. Tippit murder, but people do. And then he's on the run. He's hiding in the theater and he's followed by somebody who knows where he is, and that's the end of it. But the story of Oswald after the assassination to me says one thing, flight. That's why I don't know how people say, I think Oswald was a patsy. because he said it afterwards. Of course he did. It's a great thing to say. He's playing with everybody, because all of Oswald's actions after Kennedy's murder say only one thing: he's on his way, knowing something's wrong. Even if you want to say he just brought the rifle into the depository that day for the world-class assassin to use, he was involved in the plot.
After shooting Officer J.D. Tippit, he heads into the Texas Theater. Why did half a dozen Dallas police officers rush to the theater, all for a man suspected of not paying for a ticket on the way in?
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. It is great. I'll tell you, law enforcement was tough then. People think, how did they know he was inside the theater? They must have been tipped off to the fact that he was there. Yeah, they were tipped off, actually, because after Oswald had shot Tippit, and one person, actually two did for a while, but then one continued to follow him from a safe distance. Oswald didn't know that. They weren't right on top of him. Nobody tried to be the hero and tackled him. They knew he had a pistol, but they followed him to see where he was going. They saw him go into the Texas Theater. Now, what they would not have known, they then told the police where he was. If Oswald had gone out an emergency exit of the theater, that would have sent the police scurrying for a real thing. But Oswald thought he was safe. He was going to be in there, and when the police came in to tackle him, he does try to take the pistol. One of the policemen's, the webbing of his finger here gets caught as the hammer comes back down, much to the disdain of the policeman, but to the safety of all of them, because Oswald's going to take another shot. And he is screaming police brutality from the moment that he is taken out of the theater. So Oswald is now ready to be the person who has pulled it off. You know, it's hard to imagine, by the way, Nick. Lee Harvey Oswald had this tortured childhood in which he had been a psychiatrist, had interviewed him when he was 13, thought he had the sociopathic, aggressive, assaultive, acting out personality. He recommended he be treated by a psychiatrist. His mother didn't do that. He went into the Marines after his brother because he admired him, and they thought he was gay. They threw him in the shower. They called him Mrs. Oswald. It was an unmitigated disaster for him. He defected to the Soviet Union because he thought he'd be greeted as a hero, and the Russians thought there was something wrong with him. He tried to kill himself, failed at that. They moved him out to this little provincial capital where he hated Russia after a while. And he comes back to the United States with a Russian bride. He's unhappy here. He can't hold a job. Decides to go into history by killing Edwin Walker, and fails at that when the bullet gets deflected in a window frame. He goes to New Orleans in the summer of '63. I'd been there in New Orleans in the summer. It makes Miami seem like a cool place. And on the streets of New Orleans, he's handing out leaflets to join his new organization for Castro, Fair Play for Cuba. You know how many volunteers he gets? 0. He's failed again. So now he's going to Cuba. He goes to Mexico City, and the Soviet and Cubans reject him. He comes back to Dallas as a guy who's turned 24, succeeded at nothing in life. His wife is separated from him. The night before the assassination, he tries to get her to come back to him, and she says no. The first thing he pulls off that is a big success is a big thing. It's the murder of the president. And it's hard to imagine in a 24-year-old life who's had that type of failure to succeed at the biggest thing you've ever tried. He has almost a smirk on his face afterwards in many of those pictures. He's like the Cheshire cat who swallowed a canary. He's done it. And now he's going to play it out. Not me, I'm a patsy, please, you got the wrong person. He's having his moment. In some ways, those of us who think that Oswald did it on his own, he was the shooter, forget the question of conspiracy for a second, but that he was the assassin, we give him the most credit as pulling it off. Because I must tell you that even though he fired at Walker, a real person, and didn't know about that, the bullet getting deflected, thought he had killed Walker. We know no other instances in which he shot and killed anyone. He had practiced dry runs on the gun and he knew how to shoot. But now as the President of the United States, you can think about it in your head. You go up to that window, the car turns around the corner. We've seen this approved from, it's like a Hollywood movie. You have Mrs. Kennedy there and Chanel suit and her cap. It's straight out of Hollywood casting. The president's there, the governor with the Stetson cap. You have to have your heart beating up in your throat. And now you're going to actually shoot at the motorcade. It requires some nerves of steel. And you miss on the first shot. You must think everybody down there is looking up at you. They're going to be yelling at you in a second. You take the second shot, and the president's still alive, and you have to take the third shot. So everything else aside on Oswald, there's a moment in which he could have been unable to do it. There's a moment in which he might have been shaking so much that he couldn't have pulled it off and missed all 3 shots. So I don't say credit in the sense of giving him a pat on the back, but I mean, in terms of actually pulling off the assassination, we think of it as a question of timing. Did he have enough time for the shots? Could he have done it? But there's the emotion of trying to put yourself into the shooter's footsteps. It takes a certain personality to be a suicide bomber, to go into a restaurant and not be sweating so much that everybody sees something wrong and then blow yourself up and kill people all around you. It takes something to be an assassin as well, to pull it off. And James Earl Ray does the same thing a few years later. Sirhan does the same thing. So we don't want to think that that's the case, but for Oswald, it's hard to imagine what an overwhelming elation that had to be. And that may sound odd, but I think that was the case that day.
Right. Why did Jack Ruby kill Oswald?
I wish that I could give a 30-second soundbite that everybody could say, that's why Ruby killed Oswald. The difficulty with Ruby is you have to understand Ruby and what happened that weekend, so that when you do understand, then you realize that, yes, it was happenstance and wasn't a conspiracy, but on its face, you think, okay, come on, Posner. I'm willing to believe that there was one lone nut that weekend in Dallas who took a shot at the president and got away with it and was lucky to pull it off. But you mean there was a second one and he had a chance to kill Oswald before Oswald spilled the beans on everybody else? And that is, in fact, what happened. Should Jack Ruby have been near Oswald? Should he have been in police headquarters when Oswald was? Absolutely not. Was the police security that weekend around Oswald good? It was horrible. Ruby wasn't just there on Sunday when he killed Oswald. He was there on Friday night when Oswald was arrested. Jack Ruby is a nightclub owner, has a carousel, a strip club. What's he doing at police headquarters when the arrested assassin is there? Because he knows all the police who hang out at his strip club. And what is he doing? He's giving out his business card to reporters. He gave it out to a guy from Agency Francaise, to a fellow Italian reporter, and said, by the way, when this is all over, be sure to stop in the carousel before you leave Dallas. Jack Ruby is a guy who likes to be where the action is. He's a wannabe mobster, a tough guy. And where the action was police headquarters. He even puts on a pair of glasses and takes a notepad and gets into the press conference and asks a question of Oswald that night when Oswald's taken out at midnight. So let's assume for a second that Ruby, who somebody in the Chicago mob called him up and said, Jack, this guy Oswald, he's key to the assassination. If he talks, everything unravels. We forgot to kill him after the president was killed. He got away. He walked out the front door. We didn't put anybody there, but he's been arrested. You got to kill him. So Jack says, okay, biggest assignment of my career. Goes there Friday night. Oswald walks near Ruby at one point. He's taken away. We have shots of them inside the... Does Jack go for his gun, which you can see actually a picture of in the back of his... No, he decides, you know what? I should kill this guy or everybody will be caught. I'm not in the mood. So Saturday, he goes back to police headquarters. Oswald's there again and is taken out. Jack must not be in the mood. Doesn't do it on Saturday. And on Sunday, Jack's not going down to see Oswald. He's going downtown to send a MoneyGram to a stripper of his who's called up and needs the money. And the only Western Union MoneyGram station in all of Dallas is in downtown Dallas. Oswald was supposed to have been moved that morning, but he's delayed because a postal inspector comes to examine him about the shipment of the rifle. Oswald asks for a change of clothes. Jack goes downtown, sees the crowd is still there, sends off the MoneyGram. It's time-stamped by Western Union, comes out, the crowd's still there, walks down the street, and as the policeman moves away from the entrance to the garage so the cars can start to go, Jack goes downstairs, and by this time he's been worked up over the weekend to think that no-good scoundrel killed the president. I'm going to even the score by killing him. It's an impulsive move by Ruby, who's an impulsive guy. It's the chance opportunity at that moment. And it is out of the movie. When he shoots Oswald, you know, you killed my president, you rat type of thing. And when he's picked up by the police, he says, I'm Jack, I'm Jack, I'm Jack. He thinks he's going to be patted on the back. Ruby thinks in his world that people are going to say, you know, Jack, that was a good thing you ended up doing. Texas had a law back then called murder without malice, 5-year max. Ruby thought that's the most he might ever serve. He had no idea that what he had done. He robbed all of us of the truth in the case. And one thing, Nick, I look at Ruby's murder of Oswald, and so horrible murder, and I'm furious at Ruby for having robbed us of the chance of a trial. People view it as a silencing. What we forget about is that 72 hours after the assassination, 24 hours after, on that Sunday, a day before the Nick Katzenbach Memo came out, or shortly before, people thought Oswald was guilty. There wasn't a lot of doubt about it at that time. There's a group of people, hundreds of people that had formed in Dallas to watch Oswald get transferred. They'd announced he was going to be transferred. When the word spread on the street, there's a CBS News crew was filming locally that when the word spread on the street that Oswald had been shot, they didn't know if he was dead or who shot him or anything else, the crowd breaks spontaneously into applause. It's a chilling moment because we forget all these years later the tremendous anger toward Oswald. People thought he was the assassin. There was even this cheering of the idea that he'd been shot. I think later, years later in 1995, there was a moment when Tim McVeigh had been arrested for the Murrah bombing, and the FBI took him out, and McVeigh was a head taller than everybody around him in an orange jumpsuit, and they weren't providing any security for him. And I thought, boy, somebody who lost a person at the Murrah building could take a shot at him right now. I hope they don't, because it'll look like a silencing of McVeigh. This is the problem. And we forget all these years later how people thought Oswald was the person, but Ruby robbed us of ever hearing the evidence.
So the National Archives recently released a lot of Kennedy files that have been classified for decades. Anything in there that has supported your case or contradicted your case?
There's nothing that's contradicted the conclusion that Oswald alone killed Kennedy, and I think that's been to the frustration of a lot of conspiracy theorists over the years. I published in '93. There's still hundreds of thousands of documents yet to be released. And I had some journalists say to me, you put your neck out on the line because you've done it before all these other documents came out. I never really understood that, because what I was doing in 1993 was saying, here's my view as a researcher, historian on what happened on November 22nd, 1963. All of the evidence says Lee Harvey Oswald alone killed Kennedy. If documents came out that proved there was a conspiracy in the assassination of the president, I have no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was the shooter if they proved that he was doing it for some organization. If those files are there, I'll be the first one sitting down with everybody else looking at them, but I don't think that they exist. And the reason for that is we forget that in files that are still sealed today, there are 3,500 still remaining, supposed to come out in June of 2023. We'll see if that happens. They keep going down the road. They were reviewed, all of them, by the Assassination Review Board, a group set up in the 90s to determine which files should be released to the public. They saw all the documents that are currently in the National Archives and then sent them over to the National Archives for safekeeping. Hard for me to imagine that that board of great experts saw something that would change the course of history on what we know on the assassination. They've been able for 20 years not to leak that to the New York Times or the Washington Post. But that aside, people do ask, the average layperson, if you stop 10 people on the street and you say, what's one of the reasons you think there's a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination? I bet you that 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 will say that because they're hiding all those files for so many years. What are they hiding? If they didn't have something to hide, why would they still be sealed 60 years later? It's a great question. I've thought they should have been out decades ago. I think one of the great mistakes the government made is holding on to these for so long. But now, as we get more released, we just had some released, as a matter of fact, in April 27th of 2023, we understand why the CIA has fought so hard to keep them sealed. It's usually about intelligence operations that the agency is involved with other countries, or about names of agents, or they are disclosing finally where the stations are for foreign stations that we kept in other countries. I still have trouble imagining, when I see the files unredacted, why they fought so hard to keep them sealed, because it seems to me that they've been too sensitive to keep the information classified at the expense of public trust. One last thing. Let's assume for a second I'm completely wrong and there was a secret, deep state conspiracy to kill the president. It's almost the perfect crime, because they got away with it. They've duped people like me to think it's Oswald, and there's no conclusive evidence of who the real shooter was or anything else. So the secret state, the deep state, got away with killing the president, and somebody made one error. It's only one error they made. somebody inside the conspiracy took a smoking gun document that unmasked the entire thing, and they sent it to the National Archives. Not just that they didn't destroy it, they sent it somehow to the archives. And once it was sent to the archives, the CIA decided not to break into the archives and destroy the document, but they've left it there so that the archives can, in the process of disclosing documents, release it to the public. So my point is that if there had been such a conspiracy, and there were documents that disclosed the details of those conspiracy, I really don't think they're going to be the last documents released from the National Archives. They would have been destroyed long ago. They didn't keep it a murder for 60 years as a secret that I and others failed to uncover by making a mistake like that.
Right. And what questions remain for you after all that you've done?
The question that remains for me is twofold, and they're related a little bit. Goes back to Mexico City, where Oswald was only 6 weeks before the assassination. There's a report that Oswald had at the Soviet mission. We know he took his pistol out and slammed it on the desk at one point. We know that from the Russian files. At the Cuban consulate at one point, he supposedly said, I could kill the president if I wanted to. Would you then think I was a good enough communist? But we don't have the Cuban files. I'd love the Castro government, says they are in Cuba, to release everything that they have in terms of their own material from the embassy to see what they might, not that they knew, but did Oswald even say that at that time? Do we know that from the Cubans? The other thing I'd like to know is whether the CIA picked up any evidence of Oswald making that type of threat, a general threat, when he was there. Because if so, what should they have done when he re-entered the country? They should have then turned it over to the FBI, which they didn't do. So, the CIA ever done that? Yes. Do the agencies cooperate? No. Did they do that on 9/11 when the CIA followed 2 potential hijackers in the country who eventually were involved in 9/11 and didn't tell the FBI until August of 2001, although they'd been living in California under their real names with driver's license for a year? Yes, the CIA has done that. Would it be terribly embarrassing for the agency if they knew more about how unstable Oswald was and didn't tell the FBI so that the FBI would then know that the president's motorcade was going in front of him? Yes. But that's what I would be interested in.
You recently leveraged the artificial intelligence tool ChatGPT to ask 7 questions on the Kennedy assassination. What insights did you glean from that exercise?
I gleaned that ChatGPT-4 is not always as wrong as we sometimes think it can be. It can be brilliant, it can be wrong, it can give us odd answers, it can do mathematical calculations faster than anything we imagine, and do great limericks, and also can give pretty good information so far on the Kennedy assassination. It gives you, says, no, there are a lot of conspiracy theories when asked about who killed Kennedy, but that the general consensus is Lee Harvey Oswald was almost certainly the shooter. It talks about the Jack Ruby and what his motivation might have been, that the Ruby killed him as not part of a conspiracy. I asked about Oliver Stone's JFK film, which it said was a very, very good film, but is generally derided by critics and historians as being factually inaccurate. What is coming up in the JFK files, and it hedges its bet. Now, what I'm interested in is I printed the verbatim questions that I asked and the answers about a month and a half ago. AI is an evolving mechanism. It's an evolving beast of information fed to it. So I'll be very interested in doing what I call 1-year checkups on what is AI saying now about the assassination. Has more conspiracy come into it or less conspiracy over a period of time? Because, you know, the machine is only as good as what it has in terms of this information. And I was intrigued that at least it had enough to make a clean sweep at the assassination. Now, if you're a conspiracy theorist, if you think that the secret government was involved in the assassination, works like my own or anything else that says it's Oswald are probably part of the cover-up, Chat's answers probably indicate that AI is controlled by the government, because you would tend to think that if it was really independent, it would know it was a conspiracy.
Right. Final question. What's the weakness in your conclusion, if any?
The weakness is that we don't have the absolute evidence of Oswald doing the shooting that day in terms of a film. There's no, surveillance camera inside of the sixth floor of the depository. They don't have any CCTV.
Right.
But I've often thought, I've argued with conspiracy theorists about this now for 30 years, and I've gotten to understand how they think. So I used to think, it's a shame there's no CCTV footage inside the depository, and there was footage of Oswald at the window with his gun. Today, if I provided that to conspiracy theorists, even at the time, they would have said, that's only a picture of Oswald with his gun at the window. Maybe that was set up a week before just to have him take some pictures, and he was told to do that. How do we know that was November 22nd? So now let's say it was a wide angle, and I was able to see the motorcade going by. They would say, well, how do we know that he fired the gun and he wasn't just as a backup? Okay, so now we have sound of the tape. We hear the sounds of the shots. There are 3 shots. They would say, how do we know that what Oswald was shooting weren't blanks and that the real shooter was in the front? Maybe Oswald was led to believe that he would be the assassin. He was put there that day, but the government made sure that they would kill Kennedy by putting the real assassin on the grassy knoll. Oswald fired the shots thinking they were real and they were blanks. The real assassin killed him from the front. I realized that even if I had the sound tape and the video, there would be people that say, I don't think that that was him killing the president. So you ask me what's missing? What's missing is common sense. What's missing is logic. What's missing is the ability to accept that history can be changed by one person with one gun and one bullet. We should know that. We saw World War I start with the assassination of the Archduke. We saw Lincoln assassinated. We know that history can be changed that way, but people just refuse to accept it here, and that's unfortunate, but it's the way it is. I don't think anything, even a confession from Oswald. People say that Marina Oswald, everything she said that her husband had tried to kill General Walker and that she took the pictures of him in the backyard holding the rifle. She must have said that because she was afraid they were going to deport her back to Russia. Then she became an American citizen. She was still saying the same thing. And they said, well, she said it for so many years, she's brainwashed, she believes it now. If Oswald confessed to the crime, they would say he's doing it to protect himself and his family or they're going to kill Marina. When James Earl Ray confessed to the crime and then took it back, they said, see, he confessed to the crime because he thought they were going to kill him. So there's no answering a hardcore conspiracy theorist on it.
You cannot reason with conspiracy theorists or truth seekers. It's a bottomless pit.
It is a bottomless pit. There are people that think that Sirhan Sirhan, who wrote in his book Robert Kennedy Must Die and shot him at close range with a pistol, is innocent of the crime that somebody else killed Robert Kennedy. So it's hard to say when you say what piece of evidence is missing that I would like. Whatever, there is more evidence that I would like that I would think makes it even more conclusive, but it's not going to solve anybody to believe the case. One last thing on this. I think that I'm pretty well convinced that 2 planes went into the World Trade Center towers and 1 plane went into the Pentagon and 1 went into a field. The 19 hijackers pulled off the greatest attack on America in an act of terror. But there are people that think that the planes were on remote control and the buildings were imploded. So there's the evidence. Boy, I was saying you got videotape evidence, all the evidence of other planes. Sometimes you can't convince people no matter what the evidence is.
Right. Gerald Posner, this has been an absolute treat. What's your next case?
That's a very good question. I'm still trying to figure out what that is because I know it's a 3 or 4 year project of trying to unravel the details. And I, at one point, think it could be about military use of AI.
Very, very interesting subject. So we'll look forward to looking out for that one.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick.
Gerald, thank you so much for your time. That'll do it for us at Hindsight History. We'll see you next time.